Thank you very much for joining us at this inaugural PETRA-E conference. I won't say very many words apart from that. I'm really glad to see so many of you. And please keep an eye on your inbox throughout the course of the conference, because you'll keep receiving links inside that inside your inbox with various panels and keynotes that you can connect to. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Michael Cronin, the director of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, to welcome you to the centre virtually or in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for the introduction. And already on the screen, I can recognize some familiar faces, so it's good to feel that one is among colleagues and scholars and friends. A chuirte gael is gael, bhailm hain, har ceann lár in it astracán litríochta agus cultúr chláiste na trínoide, fáilte I chealaí a chur rih chuileghine an ócáid starúil seo sé sin an céad chógáil literathe faoi chuirmeacha PETRA-E. On behalf of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, I want to say how delighted I am that some of you are both physically present here and others are virtually present for what I believe is a historic occasion and the first international conference that has been organized by the PETRA-E Network. One of the things that occurred to me when I was, thinking about this conference and the location here in this historic building in the centre of Dublin was some of our former students who were translators, and one of them was a very occasional translator, apparently not a very zealous one, but was the author of Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. He entered the university at the age of 14 in 1682, and he exited the university 2 years later with a degree with a very special Latin title. And usually when you get degrees with special Latin titles in Trinity, it means you haven't worked very hard, and they don't want to make it very explicit just how awful your degree qualification is. But he did pull up his socks and he became a doctorate of divinity in 1702. Swift had one experience of translating from the Irish language that I began my welcome with, and it was a translation called A Description of an Irish Feast. And the first two lines were, O'Rourke's feast, ne'er to be forgot, by those who are there and those who are not. So I hope that this will be the memory that you'll have of the PETRA-E conference. But it was based on an Irish poem called Pléireachta na Ruarcach. And there are many stories about how he did this translation, but one of them involves his meeting with a blind harpist called Turlough O'Karlijn, a very famous both player and composer of Irish traditional music, merging with the classical tradition. So he met with Karlijn, and there's a story that's told about what happens then. So the dean admired Karlijn's genius, had him frequently at the deanery house in Dublin, so very near where we are here in Trinity College, and used to hear him play and sing the Pléireachta. There was a kind of musical version of this poem. He was particularly struck by with the happy and singular onomatopoeia in several passages of the original, particularly that which represented the sound of wet in the dancer's shoes, glug, glug in Irish Gaelic. This was thought to be inimitable in English words, till Karlijn asked a servant to walk in shoes over a pool of water and dance before him and Jonathan Swift. This coincided with the dean's own whimsical fancy. The experiment was made, and the dean caught the sound and expressed it by splish, splash, in their pumps. So it seems to me that this kind of early example of somebody, a student who's faced with a particular kind of translation conundrum with respect to a form of literary translation, it suggests the kind of the inventiveness, the creativity, also the way in which, you know, literally you have this kind of practical experiment, an early form of interactive pedagogy in terms of how you're going to teach or talk about translation. But I think there's a more serious backdrop or context to our deliberations, both today and tomorrow. The Senegalese forestry engineer, a man called Baba Dioum, once said that we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. In the deliberations around climate change, the climate catastrophe that is potentially ahead of us all, there's a great deal of talk about quantitative measures, reducing carbon emissions, and so on. There's a great deal less talk about something that is equally vital, which is the protection of biocultural diversity, because it is precisely biocultural diversity that underpins the capacity for resilience of cultures in different parts of the world. And this, it seems to me, is where literary translators are absolutely at the heart of the matter. In other words, it's what literary translators do in terms of constructing, maintaining, promoting biocultural diversity that provides the absolutely vital underpinning for the efforts that we're going to make to deal with this crisis. So it seems to me that with this in mind, the deliberations and the work of all of us over the next 2 days carry with it an importance that's not just there at national levels or European levels, but arguably at transnational and global levels as well. So with these words, I just want to wish everybody every success, enjoyment, instruction over the next 2 days. And I would now like to hand over to my colleague from the UK, Professor Duncan Large, who is going to open the conference, the PETRA-E part of the conference proper. Thanks, Duncan.
Now then, it feels as if I'm kind of under video surveillance here, but I'll try and split my attention between the eye and the sky and the room ahead of me. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, James, and all at Trinity College who've played a part in bringing about this event. It's a hugely exciting event, it seems to me, for a number of reasons, not least because we have an excellent program of panels and individual papers ahead of us over the next day and a half. I suspect I'm by no means alone in saying this is the first conference I've actually attended in person since, well, February 2020. So it's great to be able to physically meet up with colleagues again. But this is, of course, a hybrid event, and there are many attending and presenting virtually as well, which adds significantly to the complexity of the arrangements and makes us all the more grateful for the immense amount of work that has gone into making this event happen and happen safely for all. This is a tremendously exciting event, finally, in the context of the PETRA-E network itself. For, as Michael was saying, this is the first event of its kind in the history of the network. PETRA-E began life as an Erasmus-funded project involving 8 partners from across Europe, including the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, where I work. Over a couple of years then, 2014 to 16, the project had a series of meetings and dissemination events, which culminated in the publication of the Framework of Reference for the Education and Training of Literary Translators in 2016, in hard copy in 8 languages at the time and online. Over the last 5 years then, PETRA-E has lived on and grown into a network of now 30+ institutions committed to the implementation of the framework and the coordinated development of literary translator training across Europe. We've been meeting regularly in person and more recently online for network meetings, but this is the first time we've held an academic conference. We thought this an appropriate way to mark 5 years since the publication of the initial framework. And we're very grateful to James, to Michael, and to Trinity for volunteering to host us. So as chair of the PETRA-E Network, it's my great pleasure to welcome you, whether your institution is already a member of the network or not. And we're always happy to welcome new members. At this point, let me immediately switch hats and welcome you also to the opening panel, which is devoted to the PETRA-E Framework in action, implementation and impact. So we're kicking off the conference in this way because of the central importance of the framework to the work of PETRA-E overall. Since 2016, our emphasis has been on raising awareness of the framework, but also garnering feedback and responses with a view to developing and updating it. At the PETRA-E Network meeting, which we held this morning, we considered a first batch of revisions to the original framework, and we'll be talking about those in our panel this afternoon, no doubt. But we'll mainly be focusing on the ways in which the original framework has already proved a useful resource for translators and educators. So with me to discuss this topic are a number of colleagues who have been part of PETRA-E since the beginning, and more recently have been part of have constituted indeed the framework working group within the PETRA-E network. And so this is a subgroup who have been considering feedback and responses to the 2016 framework and focusing on its development. Now, everyone should have access to the conference app, which has a set of biographical descriptions. And so I think in the interests of time, I'm not going to rehearse those those descriptions now. Do have a look at the conference app. But there are 3 colleagues in the room with me here in Dublin, and our 4th colleague, Françoise Wuilmart, is online I presume, in Belgium. Françoise is a scholar and a prize-winning translator of philosophy and literature, principally from the German, but also from Dutch and English. In the room, we have Karlijn Waterman, who is Senior Policy Officer at the Dutch Language Union, the Nederlandse Taalunie. We have Roberta Fabbri, who is director of the Scuola Superiore per Mediatori Linguistici of the San Pellegrino Foundation in Rimini, Italy. And we also have Teodora Tzankova, who is Senior Assistant Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at the University of Sofia in Bulgaria. I think at this point, I basically bow out. We have then 3 speakers certainly in the room who have presentations prepared. So I will hand over, I think in the first instance, to Karlijn, who's going to take us on.
We start at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
And then I continue, and then yeah.
Okay.
So. Oh. Maybe it's good to have a copy of the framework here. Yeah. Please come. Yeah. So, hello everyone. I'm Karlijn Waterman, and next to me are Roberta Fabbri and Teodora Tzankova. Teodora from Sofia, Roberta from Rimini. I'm from the Netherlands. Well, Duncan basically introduced us, introduced the network, introduced the framework, so we can skip that in the interest of time. What are we going to do? firstly, I will give you some background on the framework. And when we talk about the framework, it's about this document. For me, it always sounds a bit like a book title or a movie by a book by John Grisham, but it's this document, and it's also available online. After these backgrounds, Teodora will present the results of a survey we held on the actual use of the framework. And then Roberta will look at the framework and its implementation from the perspective of theory on teaching literary translation. I am now going to share my screen. Yes, there it is. Is it visible? Okay. Yes. Ah, yeah, okay. Well, yes, there it is. Yeah, okay. Yes. Okay. Well, it's difficult to get it. Yes, there I go. The PETRA-E framework. Here you see a copy of it. I would recommend to go to the online version, because this is a copy of a copy and it's very vague. In the paper edition, there is on the rear side of the framework, there is an introduction with information on why we made it, how it's meant. As Duncan told you, the framework was published 5 years ago in 2016 as a result of an Erasmus Plus funded project, a so-called strategic partnership. Let's take a closer look at it. What is this framework? What was it made for? Which purposes we do have with it? The framework is a combination of a competence model and a learning line, and it maps all competences a translator can develop. It identifies 8 competences, which are themselves composed of several sub-competences, and I will go over them quickly in the interest of the remaining time of this session. So firstly, there is the transfer competence, which refers to the act of translation, the act of translating something from one language, from one culture into another one. Then there is the language competence, that is about all kinds of linguistic knowledge that a translator needs, literary knowledge, grammar, style, pragmatics, language variation. Thirdly, there is the textual competence, which covers everything related to comprehension and analyzing texts, and it also covers editorial competences. Then there is the heuristic competence, which is about the ability to gather all kinds of information a translator needs to make a translation, information on the subject, using all kinds of information sources, digital and offline sources. The literary cultural competence applies to literary and cultural knowledge and the ability to apply that knowledge, for example, and also knowledge of the source and the target literature and culture, such as situating the text in a literary tradition, or knowing and being able to translate cultural specific elements. There is the professional competence, which covers knowledge and skills as knowledge about the publishing field, ethical knowledge, knowledge of legal and financial aspects of translation, and also entrepreneurial skills. The evaluative competence is the before last one, and that's about assessment of translation, of one's own translation and translation by others, and also assessment in a didactic context. And finally, there's the research competence, which deals with translations as object of research. And it's about knowing research methods, knowing schools of translation. And then all these competences in turn are defined by descriptors. We try to limit those descriptors because of the usability of the framework. And then in addition, the framework also identifies levels in the acquisition of those competences, starting with LT1, literary translation 1, which is a beginner level, up until LT5, the expert level. To avoid misunderstanding, people tend to think that these correspond with academic years or levels, but this is not the case. So it's not the first academic year is LT1 and so on. So why we made this framework? We had several aims and purpose in mind when we start the whole PETRA-E project. And initially, one of the main purposes of the framework was to be instrumental in collaboration between academic and non-academic training of literary translators, and also in European collaboration. And the idea was to overcome ancient boundaries between theorists and practitioners, academics and non-academics. And the framework, the idea of a framework gave a kind of shared basic agreement on the fact that literary translation requires a great deal of knowledge and even more specific skills. The concept of competences was ideal to start with, because one of the basic assumptions behind this is that translation, that it consists of the fact that it doesn't matter where you acquire a certain competence. It can be in a university program, it can be in a course, it can be by learning the language when you are living in a country, it can be learning heuristic skills in a completely other context. Basically, the literary translation competence is a compilation of many different competences that can be acquired in many contexts. Consequently, the framework provides translators and students of translation with a tool to determine their competence level and also to identify gaps in their education and to gain more insight in the process of acquiring new skills. And for teachers, it can help them to identify gaps in levels of their students and gaps in their proficiency. And it can give them also more insight in the process of teaching skills. And there are also good examples of teachers who use the framework as a didactic tool themselves. And for universities and schools and programs, they can use the framework as a benchmark for their program and also as a reference tool to design a curriculum on literary translation. So these are the aims we had with the framework, and we were obviously very curious how this worked out in practice. Therefore, we carried out a survey among institutions that teach literary translation. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Teodora to present the results of that survey.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I just have to switch the file. So I will stop sharing for a moment. So, yeah. Well, the impact of the PETRA-E framework on teaching literary translation in Europe hasn't been studied in a systematic way. That is the reason why, as Karlijn said, 5 years after the launch of the framework in 2016, we decided to conduct a survey with that particular goal in mind. It intended to answer the following questions. Has the framework changed the approach to teaching literary translation, and in what way? Has it led to the emergence of new translation programs or courses? Has it modified existing ones, and how? Which competences described in the framework have a stronger presence in the current translation programs, and why? Our purpose was to outline tendencies which on its turn may lead to conclusions regarding both the usefulness of the framework and the current state of the art of literary translation education. The survey was directed at people involved directly or indirectly in teaching literary translation, both inside and outside the academy, that are acquainted with the framework to a certain degree at least. The main addressees were, of course, the members of the PETRA-E network. Nevertheless, we tried to reach other interested parties via social media and our personal contacts. Needless to say, we cannot claim that the results we have are exhaustive, but considering their variety, we have reasons to believe that they are to a significant degree representative. As for the respondents, the survey was completed by 35 people working in 16 European countries and representing 26 institutions. We have received most answers from Romania, you see on the chart, Belgium and Spain. All of the represented institutions are academic ones, except CETL, Central European de Traducción Literaire based in Belgium, Villar de Letras in Spain, and the high school in Romania. Then 80% of 20 or 28 of the respondents are affiliated with institutions that are members of the PETRA-E network. It is worth noting in this context that several of the members of the network have not viewed in the survey. Therefore, their contribution to the use of the PETRA-E framework in teaching practice cannot be taken into account and will remain invisible for now. As for the remaining 20%, which are not members of the PETRA-E network, most of them, if not all, have implemented the framework quite efficiently and use it above all as an inspiration for incorporating new material into existing courses and as an evaluation tool. 3/4 of the respondents teach practical courses on translation, more than half teach translation theory, a bit above 40%, well, 42.9 is the share of the program directors. A little more than half of the respondents are literary translators themselves, while the rest are involved in teaching literary translation without being engaged in the practice of the activity. The last observation is in line with the findings of the CEATL's report on training and education in literary translation, which accounts for the relatively small number of practitioners among the teachers of literary translation in the academia. Now we go to the section about the general use of the framework. This section covers the uses of the framework in communication and as a marketing and evaluation tool. It registers the impact of the framework on the approach to teaching literary translation and on defining the learning outcomes of literary translation programs. The informal influence of the framework among teachers of literary translation is distinct as it is a topic of conversation between colleagues for more than 80% of the respondents. Just 11.4 or 4 don't refer to it at all. It seems to be gaining some institutional recognition as well, since it is mentioned in discussions with the administration of the academic institutions. 4 of the respondents talk about it often, and 14 sometimes. The share of those who use it in procedures of evaluation or inspection is also noticeable. 17% of the respondents do it often, and twice as many, 34 sometimes. Now, regarding the general approach to teaching literary translation, the main asset of the framework lies in the fact that it gives a more holistic view on the process. This statement is valid for 57.1% of the respondents. A change in approach is manifested practically as well, although in fewer cases. The framework has led 1/3 of all respondents to incorporate new material into their existing courses, and 17% to restructure their program of study according to the literary levels described in the document. The framework has matched the already existing practice of 1/4 of the respondents without changing it, while other 14% declare that it hasn't had any effect on their approach. Finally, one respondent represents an institution whose program has been used as a model for the framework. That's master in literary translation at Utrecht University. In the process of teaching, the framework is referred to mostly when people present the whole program or module to their students. However, less often, it is mentioned during the presentation of concrete material. More than 1/3 of the teachers use it when they ask their students to self-assess their level, and more than 1/4 of them use it as an assessment tool themselves. 20% of the respondents don't refer to the framework explicitly while teaching, more than half of which explain it without being required to, with the fact that they have joined the PETRA-E network very recently or have not joined it yet, so they don't feel entitled to do so. The framework hasn't changed the way most teachers evaluate their students. Nevertheless, nearly 1/4 of the respondents assess their students at the bachelor's degree according to the competences achieved at the end of the first level described in the framework, and a slightly bigger number, 9, assess their students at the master's degree according to the competences achieved at the end of the second level. This fact shouldn't go unnoticed, not only because it proves the potential use of the framework to be used as an evaluative tool, but also because it establishes a clear correspondence between the bachelor's degree and the first level on one hand, and the master's degree and the second level on the other. Such a correspondence is hinted at in one of the paratexts of the framework, but not stated clearly in the framework itself. The framework is not used as an evaluation tool for PhD students or in the context of non-academic activities. The framework is used as a marketing tool by half of the respondents. 1/4 mention the framework in the description of their program, while 1/3 refers to the competences of the framework in their market materials. It is not usual, however, to enter into details. The concrete level acquired at the end of a program is mentioned by just 3 of the respondents, and the level required at the beginning in just 1 case. The framework has changed the learning outcomes of the academic programs to a moderate extent. 42.9% of the respondents consider its effect in this aspect average, by giving it 3 points in a scale from 1 to 4, sorry, in a scale from 1 to 5. As of now, those who find its impact greater are only a third as many as those who find it weaker, as it is clearly seen in the graph, in the chart. As for application of the framework to programs of study in a more concrete way, the first thing we have to say is that it has led to the emergence of new translation courses of study. There are 4 of them, 2 at bachelor's level and 1 at master's level, and 1 non-academic one. Yeah, the bachelor program Translation and Interpreting Studies at the Dunărea de Jos University in Romania has based its literary translation component on the framework. The whole course is entirely new and will start in the next academic year. The information about the other bachelor program at the University of Burgundy and about the master's program at the University of Wrocław is inconclusive, as it is not confirmed by the websites of the corresponding institutions. Finally, Villar de Letras, a Spanish non-academic school, is currently developing a new program on the basis of the framework. The framework has led to the emergence of new translation modules of study. It has generated various modules within already existing courses, 3 at bachelor's level and 5 at master's level. The new modules cover the literary cultural competence and the research competence, both in 5 cases above all the other competences of the framework. Then the textual competence, the professional competence, and the evaluative one fall in 4 cases. One of the biggest assets of the framework so far is the wide integration of new teaching material into existing courses or modules. You can see here that the answers with yes, the blue columns are higher than the red ones. So this is really an asset. The phenomenon is more powerful at master's level in 18 cases than at bachelor's level in 14 cases, but it's relevant in both. While it has no effect at PhD level, it has some influence on non-academic institutions. The new teaching material concerns mostly the textual competence, the literary cultural competence, and the evaluative competence. On this chart, we can compare the competences described in the framework covered by the new modules. These are with blue, and the competences in the framework covered by the new teaching material introduced in already existing modules. It can be inferred from the changes in the programs of study reported so far that before the launch of the framework, the textual competence, the literary cultural competence, and the evaluative competence were somehow underrepresented. The framework helped us to put a focus on them and gave reasons for their incorporation. Suggestions for improvement, they go in 3 directions. The first one asks for expansion and particularization of the competence, as well as for more didactic material to exemplify them. The second one recommends better technical communication in the sense of replacing black boxes by entries. You know that blank boxes can be confusing sometimes. And the third one calls for more visibility. And finally, the conclusions. The PETRA-E framework hasn't produced a radical change in teaching practice. Its presence is still probably more informal than formal. The programs of study that integrate new teaching material or structure themselves in accordance with the framework are far more than those that emerge entirely on the basis of the document. This is not bad news, since it exemplifies the adaptability of the framework. Besides, it also draws attention to the fact that in many cases, the document responds to conceptions which have already been in there, but haven't quite received a proper place in the curricula. Having said that, the main asset of the framework lies in the fact that it gives an encompassing picture of literary translation competences and helps enrich a program of study with what has been so far lacking. It also serves as an evaluation tool, although its potential in this area hasn't been fully developed. This is all. Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to my colleague, Roberta Fabbri.
Thank you, Teodora. Stay here because you have to help me to put the other. Okay, here we are. Okay. Thank you. And okay, so let us come back to what we might call the backbone of the framework, the teaching of literary translation. And let us focus now on the various theories in the matter in the pedagogies adopted in courses. As Duncan Large states in his keynote lecture at the 4th European School of Literary Translation in September 2020, the inclusion of theory in the framework was one of the, there is a kind of resistance to theory within the translation world. And the inclusion of theory in the framework was one of the most discussed topic among the PETRA-E group. So there's this kind of resistance. There's still a gap between theory and practice and in the teaching of translation. And this was one of the challenges of the framework that aims to help overcome traditional boundaries between the academic and non-academic, between theory and practice, and includes, among the various kinds of recommended research competence, both familiarity with translation theories and familiarity with school of thought in translation studies. An attempt to overcome this gap is the experience of the ESLT, European School of Literary Translation. Founded in 2017, the ESLT is organized by 4 partners: British Centers for Literary Translation, Center of Expertise for Literary Translation, Flanders, Netherlands, Fondazione Campus San Pellegrino, and from last year also PETRA-E. EST focuses on the training the teacher of literary translation, and it brings together around 25 translators and educators from across Europe. The 4 days program includes lectures, seminars, and workshops. The focus of last edition of here are some pictures in Rome when we were in presence in Rome, and then this is a picture of last edition, online edition, and the focus of last edition of September was on digital teaching and diversifying literary translation. The ESLT implements the PETRA-E framework, and the experience of the European School lead us to think that theory is a relevant component in the pedagogy of translation, a component that leads to a greater awareness of the translation process and of the dynamics that involve the translator in his or her activity. A theory, or rather we should say a reflection, that is a form of knowledge coming from the experience of the text. In this sense, the various theory of translation enlighten the translation process and can increase the development of skills. And this is one of the reasons why we have included them in the framework. But we can also turn the matter upside down. The framework can also benefit translation theory because it forces it not to an abstract speculation, but to a continuous confrontation with the reality of translation. Thinking of the framework as a map of skills needed by a literary translation, it could be very useful in designing education and training programs that include theory in an integrated approach. And now we see a brief look at some of the theory and pedagogies of literary translation and how they can be integrated in the framework. There are different theories of literary translation and subsequently different approaches to literary translation teaching. Following the European Society of Translation Studies, there are at the present time 350 programs worldwide devoted to the teaching of translation. The emergence for this field is connected with the development of a fairly standard curriculum for teaching, and an interesting field of research could be comparing the way translation is taught with the content of the framework. Paradoxically, the emergence of the discipline is not connected with a higher reputation of translation. In many cases, translation courses are held not by professional translators, and translations are not considered academic papers for tenure and promotion. Both these two antinomies bring the implicit argument of thinking of translation as a marginal activity and not for its real value. Loris Venuti, in his book dedicated to teaching translation, argues that the majority of programs on training translators assume the model or paradigm of translation that he calls the instrumental model. I quote, in which translation is seen as a reproduction or transfer of an invariant that is contained or in or caused by the source text, whether its form, its meaning, or its effect. It's a kind of model in contrast to what is the current orthodoxy in literary and cultural studies, that is the hermeneutical model that conceives translation as an interpretative act. Following Venuti's analysis, a question arises: should we consider the framework an instrumental model? In our opinion, no, because it is an open tool, not prescriptive, an analytic tool that makes explicit what already is implicit for a professional translator. And despite its fixed graphic shape, it doesn't limit or block the creativity of the translator. Well, we see, I tried not to read everything. In their survey of translation pedagogies, Loris Venuti and Sonia Collina assert that the teaching of translation has witnessed a shift from a positivist to a constructivist epistemology, from teacher-oriented to student-oriented approaches, from the veneration of the source and target texts to a veritable discovery of the translator and the translation process. And with a positivistic approach, they intend positivistic epistemology in which reality is autonomous from the knowing subject and not constructed for knowledge, which is therefore regarded as an objective and can be transmitted as such. The positivist approach focuses on the transfer of the knowledge from teacher to students. This method, still very popular in many courses, considers translation as a mechanical process. The only way to learn how to translate is observing your master and obeying him. This implies that the transfer happens more or less automatically. The emphasis is on source text and target text rather than on students or the translation process. Fortunately, this positivist approach has recently been replaced by a constructivist epistemology. Following this pedagogy, knowledge is not something fixed and objective that must simply be transmitted but something that is built in interaction. The role of the trainer is to allow students to integrate the knowledge process. In this case, the framework is a help because it allows students to interact on some fundamental issues and work on specific skills. The aim of this approach is not to find a definitive translation, but to develop the ability to make decisions and choices. And I think that I have to skip this one. Among this kind of approach, one I can let's see. I can quote. I can mention Joanna Drugan and Chris Megon that wish to include in teaching all those aspects going beyond the text. For example, they argue for the need to instruct students in ethics. This need is not fulfilled by the Code of Professional Conduct of Translator. And they write, training will be to enable translation students to identify the ethical issues as they arise in particular circumstances, to analyze how these issues should shape their actions, and thus to choose an action which constitutes an effective response in the situation faced. To achieve this aim, they propose a pedagogy that integrates the teaching of ethics into the translation curriculum through the use of case studies. In the framework working group, we are discussing this topic. We pointed out also from the feedback received that ethics is not included in the framework in a systemic way. In fact, ethics is mentioned briefly in the professional competence, and we are evaluating the opportunity to better specify the subject. And I think that I can skip this one and the teaching. And well, I will arrive at the what is for Venuti and Collina some future direction that are quite interesting for me. The scholarship of translation pedagogy has been dominated by functionalist theories and by methods that are constructivist, empirically based, and linguistic oriented. The research that has transformed translation studies since the 18th approaches that have brought closer to developments in literary and cultural studies by pursuing sociological and political orientations has yet to make a significant contribution to teaching the practice of translation. The crucial question is how to mediate between research that is largely theoretical speculation on the one hand, post-structuralist in its basic assumption, and post-colonial or feminist in its ideological standpoint, and the teaching of translation practice on the other hand, when that practice can involve pragmatic and technical as well as humanistic text. And I read the conclusion, I skip this one. In recent years, translation has become the central theme for a reflection on modernity, and certainly only constructivist pedagogies can train sophisticated translators to be capable of mastering diverse bodies of knowledge and leading students to a self-critical awareness about their translating. Sorry. And these are some common conclusion and of all the paper. So we can say that the framework seems to work in ways we hoped it will do, although not fully developed in every possible way, and there is room for further development, for example, in evaluation. And we didn't take other aims of the framework into account in our survey. For example, facilitate collaboration between academic and non-academic, literary translation training, or even overcome boundaries between the two, European collaboration, or an instrument to compare training programs and an instrument to make visible the complexity of the job. It's clear that it stimulates European collaboration by the PETRA network itself and contacts that result from it by ESLT, for example. Now this collaboration is often limited to academic collaboration, lecture publication. A new area could be collaboration in program and in teacher and student exchange. This area could be for further investigation. The framework is in line with and does not contradict current theoretical approaches to literary translation teaching. For example, it is in line with a constructivist epistemology, student-centered method, a kind of pedagogy focused on the discovery of the translator and the translation process, a collaborative method, for example. And the framework seems to take into account several aspects that are stressed by scholars, such as the importance of ethics. ESLT has been a very instrumental in implementing the framework by putting into practice curriculum and lesson design, by demonstrating how the framework can be used in the classroom. Thank you very much. I think maybe.
No, I think we could. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Teodora. Thank you, Karlijn. It is already 2 o'clock. I know we started this session a little late, but I think we need to try and be punctual here, because there's a set of parallel sessions which are about to begin in our schedule. They're due to begin right now, so we don't want to borrow time from them. I'm sorry if you had a burning question. I've been checking the chat and haven't seen any burning questions so far, but I'm sure your presentations will have raised plenty of questions and issues in people's minds. Please do, if this is your first exposure to the PETRA-E framework and things that you would like to respond to, but we haven't had time for today, do please email the PETRA-E address, petra-e@taalunie.org, and the PETRA-E framework is available online in multiple translations as well, and you can immerse yourself in the different competence descriptors there to your heart's content. But in the meantime, we will be continuing to develop it in the ways that have been adumbrated this afternoon. So I think we should draw this session to a close then, with a thank you once again to our speakers for opening up really the framework, which is going to be, I think, hovering over in many ways if a framework can do that, the rest of the event, or perhaps in the background. So let us, at this point, this is kind of a parting of the ways. This was a plenary session. You should have received in your inboxes links to the next sessions. So do please check your inboxes and you'll find links for the next parallel sessions. But for the moment then, let's draw this opening plenary session to a close. Thank you.